Hey Unity Audio folks! Today we're going to be talking about a topic that I see quite a bit of confusion on, both from the Unity dev side as well as from the FMOD side of things, although in slightly different ways between the two of those. And I think that's just due to where people who are biasing towards familiarity on one of these tools versus the other are coming from. But the topic that we're going to be covering is what are FMOD event instances and what are voices? So we're going to start out by talking about what voices are. I usually see this question on its own from Unity developers because it's not really a core part of much of the development process. It's kind of its own niche thing that is super important to audio, but isn't important in a lot of smaller projects just because of how the default settings tend to work. And this applies to both Unity Audio and FMOD. So voices are any active audio clip that's currently playing or processing in your game scene. In order to understand voices, we must first understand channels, because each voice lives on a channel. So if we move over into Unity, if I click the FMOD tab up here and go to Edit Settings, that brings up the FMOD Settings panel here. And if I scroll down, you'll see in the bottom here, Virtual Channel Count and Real Channel Count. The defaults for these are 128 and 32 respectively. Virtual channel count is FMOD's total channel count. And what that means is it's the total number of channels that clips can be playing through at once. Real channel count is the total number of channels that clips can be playing on that all of your digital signal processing will apply to. So what this means is the real channel count are essentially the number of sounds you can hear all at once, whereas the virtual channel count is the number of sounds that can be processing. So that's super useful to keep in mind if you are dealing with a lot of kind of busy scenes and there's a lot of like voice stealing happening, and you need to make sure that certain voices continue playing even if they are stolen out of the real channel count or out of your real channel budget. We can use a setting in FMOD. Let me pull this up. Under our voice stealing settings called virtualize. And what that means is if that sound would be stolen in your voice management, it would be still kept in your virtual channels. So to summarize, your virtual channel count is your total channel count, and that accounts for anything that's active or inactive in your scene but playing. And your real channel count is anything that you can hear. Voices are simply the individual audio clips that exist in these channels. So if you had a series of footsteps going off and you could hear them, each footstep would probably be one or maybe two voices in your channels, in your real channels. I'll get into some more specific examples and demonstrations in a bit. And one additional note about voices and channels is that if you're layering sounds in FMOD, in other words, you have a single event with multiple layers, say it's a footstep and you have kind of a bass layer as well as like a material layer, and those both have clips that are playing simultaneously, each of those clips counts as one voice. Each time the event plays, you'll be using multiple voices instead of just one. So that's voices and channels. So what are event instances? Well, the short answer to that question is an event instance is just a copy of your event that's currently loaded into your scene. For the footstep example, you generally have two ways that could look. You could have one looping event instance that just is maintained and turned on and off whenever the player character is moving. Or you could track individual footsteps to an animation, in which case you'd have one individual event instance, most likely, playing every single time one of those foots hits the ground in the animation. So the instance itself is the copy that gets loaded into the game each time a sound is played. Another way of thinking about this is if we look over at this 3D emitter I have here, the play event drop down here, I can select any of these different settings to indicate when the event instance is created, and I can select any of these individual settings to change when it's destroyed. In this case, the stop and play is set to share the same scope as the event instance because this is a one-shot event we're looking at here. But in scripts, we can customize this and actually separate the two, and I'll show that a little bit later. But to summarize what this event is doing, we're just saying that whenever this object starts, whenever the start method in the object is called, we're going to create an instance of this event, load it into the game scene, and then play the event on it. And when the object is destroyed, We will then call stop on the play state of the event instance, as well as release the instance itself. So just so that we can visualize all of this a little better, I'm going to open up FMOD and set up a profiling session. In our session, we're going to be paying attention to 4 different events. Really, we only care about 2 events. The 2 looping events I only have as a comparison between 2D and 3D events. Turns out they're not really any different, but we have a 2D looping event, a 3D looping event, and then a hover sound for our button, as well as a click sound for our button. So going into the profiler, let's create a new session. Start playback in FMOD, or in Unity. Make sure live update's on, and start recording. We're going to hover our button a bunch, click on it, and then exit play mode. So if we look back at our test now, we will notice, if I expand our window, for our total instances we have 2 for most of our playback session, and those are paralleling the 2 different ambiences we had, that kind of grindy gear sound that was moving left to right, which is the 3D event, as well as the sound of our air ambience. The air is a 2D event, and the gears were a 3D event, and as you can see, they both used 1 voice each. So the number of kind of audio channels from a traditional kind of audio mixing perspective turns out to actually be irrelevant in this case. We might assume that a 2D event would have both a left and a right channel, but in this case they are kind of packaged into 1 channel. And then you can also see that these hover one-shots all existed for a very short amount of time, as well as the click one-shots. Now, if we take a look at the instances for the 2D and 3D looping sounds, the instances and voices look identical, but for the one-shots, they are slightly longer on the back end than the voices. And this is because the instance persists until the voice is no longer playing. In other words, until there's no more sound coming from that voice event. So in order to account for this, FMOD periodically will check each of its one-shot events to make sure, or really each of its events to make sure that no sound is coming from that event and it's not marked as like persistent or something. And once there's no sound coming from it, it will only then destroy the instance. So if we look at the script for our one-shot events, you'll notice that our hover event, I'm just using the runtime manager.play one-shot. However, for the play click event, I've essentially manually coded that exact same play one-shot event. So what we're doing is each time we click, we are first creating an instance in our scene of that click event. We are then starting the instance, which is where it actually plays, and then we are releasing that instance. And what this release means is as soon as this instance is no longer playing sound, we can forget about it. In fact, at this point, we can forget about it in terms of like releasing it from our game object, but the digital signal processing side of things, FMOD's sort of internal systems, will still hold on to that until they're like completely done with it. If we comment this out, however, let's try recording a session with this. So now if we look at our total instances, you'll notice this big blue chunk here, and you'll see it correlates with our one-shot event down here. For our voices, things look exactly the same as they did before, but in instances, because we're no longer releasing them, the active instance count, which is the orange bar, mirrors what we were seeing before, more or less. We have some overlaps here because we were clicking so quickly, but we have all of these persistent instances now, and this is actually a huge problem. Over time, these will start taking up more and more memory. This is essentially a memory leak. So if you don't release your instances, they will be inactive, but still persistent in memory in your scene. And this is kind of a huge gotcha to look out for. However, sometimes it makes sense to not use one-shots and to have a kind of persistent event in your scene. So to showcase this, we're going to remove this comment and then comment out our instance creation. So now the scope of our instance is in our class and not in our event. So this is no longer a one-shot event. This is now kind of a class-wide event. We're never destroying this event. We could do a safety check here. And all that this means is when this object is destroyed, we will stop our event, allow any fade outs if there are any, and then release the instance of our event. But if we create a test for this, what we'll see is that from the very start of our scene, we have one inactive instance of this one-shot click event, and then we are just periodically creating or activating that instance. So what this means is no matter what, we will always have one instance of this in our scene, which could be problematic if we wanted to have polyphony, for example, but it's also controlled in terms of memory budget to, again, only exist once. I don't prefer doing things this way most of the time, but occasionally it is super useful. So one final note on instances. Instances are useful for reducing voice count, but they themselves are not voice count. And what I mean by that is, again, if you had two sounds on one clip, for instance, this ambience here has two layers to it. Every time we play this ambience, it's using two voice channels and not just one voice channel. So if we allow only one instance of this to exist, it'll still use two voices. If we allow two instances to exist, it could use up to four, and so on and so forth. Whereas these one-shots will only ever use one voice per instance because they have a single channel. But if I adjust the max instances here, I can kind of put a cap on how many instances I want to exist, and thus I can somewhat directly control voice count as well. Stealing pertains directly to instances as well, but again controls voices because voices are based on instance playback. Oldest means that once I reach my voice cap, either my max instances for this in particular or the total real channel count limit, the oldest thing playing will be stolen. That won't be out of everything that's playing, it will be out of everything in equal or lower priority. So we can change the priority of our sounds, and it's kind of like brackets. Something of a higher priority will never be stolen by something of a lower priority. Quietest will steal the thing that is the quietest currently. Virtualize will try to maintain the stolen sound as a virtual voice. It will keep playing, but it won't actually be processed by your DSP and will be silent. None means that this event will just not play if it can't play over the voice cap. And furthest only works on 3D events, but it will try to steal the thing that is currently positioned the furthest away in the world. It might work on 2D events, but it only kind of makes sense on 3D events, I guess. So yeah, that's pretty much it for voices versus instances. Again, to summarize, instances are the actual kind of copies of your FMOD events that exist in your scene, whereas voice counts are the number of active voice clips that are being either processed, those are virtual voices, or are currently audible, which are real voices that currently exist in your scene. I hope this was clear. I hope it helps a lot of you out with any questions you had about this topic. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me on social media or leave a comment in the video. If you have any other topics that you'd love covered, please feel free to reach out to me with those. Hope you all are having an excellent week, and I'll see you next time.